iLearna. Learn today, lead tomorrow.
Okay, so picture this. You've got this massive, like, industrial facility, right? Like a refinery, maybe, or a chemical plant. Just tons and tons of pipes, tanks, all that stuff. How in the world do you figure out which parts need the most attention to, prevent some kind of disaster?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for sure.
It's almost like you need like X-ray vision to see where the problems might be hiding. Right?
Well, that's kind of where API 580 comes in.
API 580.
Yeah, it's basically the industry standard for what they call risk-based inspection.
Risk-based inspection, or RBI. So that sounds, it sounds pretty high tech, like a super sleuth kind of approach to inspections, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a more, I guess, proactive philosophy than maybe some of the older ways of doing things. Instead of just inspecting everything on like a fixed schedule, every year or whatever, RBI is about really figuring out like which pieces of equipment are actually most likely to fail, and then of course focusing your resources on preventing those problems, ideally before they even happen.
So it's about understanding risk, but not just risk in a general, kind of vague sense. We're talking about getting specific, right? Like really understanding the nuances of risk.
Exactly.
Okay.
API 580, it really emphasizes that risk. It's not just about, how dangerous something is, but also how likely it is to actually happen.
Okay. So like a small water leak,
Yeah.
that's probably low risk,
Right.
but a major explosion in a unit that's handling, flammable material, that's a whole different story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. In that case, you've got, high probability of something truly catastrophic happening. And that simple equation, risk equals probability times consequence, that's at the heart of RBI. It's all about figuring out where to prioritize based on the potential impact, right?
So why is this RBI approach such a big deal? What's wrong with the traditional way of doing inspections? What are we trying to fix here?
Well, think about it this way. Traditional inspections, they often rely on these like fixed schedules or just going by the equipment lifespan, And the problem is you could end up spending a lot of time and money inspecting things that are perfectly fine. And at the same time, you might miss these critical issues that are, kind of brewing somewhere else.
Right. So RBI is helping you avoid those inefficiencies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And focus your efforts where it matters most.
Gotcha. So API 580, it lays out a systematic framework.
Right.
Right. For actually putting RBI into practice. And I guess the first step is identifying those potential troublemakers.
Right.
What do they call those in the API lingo?
They call them damage mechanisms.
Damage mechanisms.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds pretty ominous.
Yeah.
What exactly are we talking about there?
It's essentially anything that can cause a piece of equipment to deteriorate over time. Things like corrosion,
Okay.
cracking, fatigue, anything that's going to weaken the equipment and make it more likely to fail.
Right. So we've identified the potential problems, these damage mechanisms. What's the next step in this whole RBI investigation?
Well, now we need to really figure out two crucial things.
Yeah.
How likely is each piece of equipment to actually fail? And then what would happen if it did fail? In the API 580 lingo, that's probability of failure, or POF.
EQOF.
And then consequence of failure, which is COF.
Gotcha. POF and COF. But how do you actually predict those things? It's not like you have a crystal ball.
Yeah, that's where things get interesting. Experts use a combination of data, models, and even just experience.
Okay.
They look at historical records of similar equipment,
Mm-hmm.
Industry standards. They might run some sophisticated simulations, and they even just use their own professional judgment to try to estimate these values.
So it's a blend of hard data and expert intuition.
Exactly.
So.
For POF, they'll consider factors like the rate of corrosion, stress levels, how often the equipment goes through cycles of heating and cooling, all those things that kind of contribute to those damage mechanisms we were talking about.
Right. And then for COF, it's all about like imagining the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Right? Like what's the potential fallout if this thing completely goes kaput?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Could be a fire, explosion, release of toxic chemicals, environmental damage. The goal is to quantify like how severe each consequence would be. And then, of course, that feeds into the overall risk calculation.
It really highlights how how complex it is to keep these massive facilities running safely. It's not just a walk in the park.
Oh, absolutely not. It's a huge responsibility. And API 580, it acknowledges that, RBI, this isn't a solo mission.
Oh.
It requires a whole team of experts from different disciplines all working together to get the full picture.
Okay. So you've got engineers, inspectors, maybe even financial analysts to figure out the cost of potential damage, all collaborating on this.
Absolutely. And API 580, it makes it very clear that, mitigating risk, it's not just about inspections. It could involve modifying operating procedures, upgrading materials, adding safety systems. There's a whole range of strategies.
So it's not just about, finding problems. It's about finding solutions and being proactive about it.
That's the key.
Yeah.
And remember, API 580, it's not just a rigid set of rules. It's a framework for making informed decisions, based on a really thorough understanding of risk. And it recognizes that things are constantly evolving in these dynamic environments.
Right. Equipment ages, operating conditions change, new data becomes available. You can't just, do one RBI assessment and call it a day.
Right. You got to constantly adapt.
Okay.
Update your approach based on the latest information. API 580 calls this continuous improvement. It's a really crucial element of any successful RBI program.
Okay. Let's try to bring this down to earth a little bit.
Sure.
With some real world examples. How would this actually play out in a real facility?
Okay, so imagine a pipeline that's carrying, highly flammable material.
Okay.
Even a small leak in that pipeline could ignite and cause a pretty serious fire. And that fire could potentially weaken the pipe even further.
Right.
Leading to, a catastrophic rupture. So RBI would help you identify that risk.
Okay.
And recommend, some preventative measures, maybe more frequent inspections, using a more robust material for the pipeline itself, or adding leak detection systems.
Okay. That's a pretty vivid example. It really paints a picture of how this could, help prevent some major incidents.
Nice. Here's another one. Consider a chemical plant that's using highly corrosive substances.
Right.
RBI would prioritize inspecting equipment that's exposed to those chemicals, and they might even use, specialized techniques like ultrasonic testing to detect any hidden damage beneath the surface.
So they're not just relying on visual inspections. They're using technology to dig deeper and really understand what's going on.
Exactly. They might also recommend, replacing parts more frequently, or applying special coatings, to protect the equipment from corrosion.
Okay. I'm getting a much better feel for how this works in practice, but surely there are some limitations to this approach. Right? Predicting the future is never foolproof.
Oh, you're absolutely right. API 580, it acknowledges that RBI, it's not a magic bullet. It's only as good as the data and the assumptions that feed into it.
So garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Exactly. Bad data, inaccurate assumptions, those can lead to some pretty flawed risk assessments.
Right.
And API 580 also, it really emphasizes the importance of human factors.
Yep.
Even with the best RBI program in place, you can still have human error, people operating outside of safe limits, or even, intentional sabotage. Those things can still cause problems.
Yeah. So it's a powerful tool, but it's not a substitute for good engineering judgment, proper training, and just a strong safety culture overall.
You nailed it.
Okay.
And that brings us to one of the most important takeaways from API 580, I think. It's not just a set of regulations, it's really a mindset, a way of thinking proactively about safety.
Right.
And operational excellence.
So by understanding risk, you can make better decisions about how to manage, complex systems, whether it's a chemical plant or really anything else.
Precisely. And that's what's so fascinating about this, I think. The principles of this risk-based thinking, they can be applied to so many areas, beyond just industrial facilities.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I'm already starting to see how these concepts could be relevant in my own life.
It's powerful stuff. But before we get too carried away with personal risk assessments, let's dive deeper into some of the specific recommendations in API 580. There's a lot more to uncover here.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lead the way. But before we continue, just a quick note for our listeners. Mm-hmm. Remember, this is just our interpretation of API 580.
Right.
Be sure to check out the document itself, for all the juicy details.
Yeah.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts, in the comments on our YouTube channel. We'll be back with more soon.
So, we've talked about the big picture thinking behind RBI, the philosophy of it all.
Right.
But API 580, it doesn't stop there. It really gets into the nuts and bolts of how to actually build and implement a robust program. Not just the theory, but the actual practice of it.
Okay, so let's crack that open.
Yeah.
Where do you even begin with something this complex? It seems like there are so many moving parts. So many things to consider. How do you make sure you're not missing anything crucial?
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming at first. One of the first things that API 580 really stresses is, defining your goals up front. What are you actually hoping to achieve with this RBI program? Is it primarily focused on, just safety? Or is it about environmental protection?
Yeah.
Minimizing financial risk? Or maybe it's a combination of all three.
Right. So you need a clear roadmap before you even start gathering data and crunching numbers.
Yes, exactly. And API 580, it even suggests conducting a preliminary screening of the whole facility to kind of pinpoint the areas that pose the highest risk.
Right.
And this could involve looking at, what types of chemicals they're handling, the age and condition of the equipment, any past incidents, even the expertise of the personnel.
Okay, so it's like a triage system, but for industrial facilities.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So this initial screening, it helps you prioritize resources, right? And really zero in on the areas that demand the most scrutiny.
Gotcha. So you've got your goals defined, you've identified the high risk zones. What's the next step in building out this RBI program?
Well, now we got to dive into the world of data. This is where you gather all the information you need to actually make those informed decisions about risk. And API 580 is it's quite specific about this.
Yeah, data is king, right? But what kind of data are we talking about specifically? Give me some examples.
Oh, it's a huge range. You've got your design documents, drawings, inspection records, operating procedures, process data on temperatures, pressures, flow rates, information about the materials and chemicals being used, even historical data on past incidents or near misses.
So it sounds like you're piecing together a giant jigsaw puzzle.
It can be.
Gathering these little bits of information from all corners of the facility.
Yeah, it can be a massive undertaking for sure. But API 580, it does provide some really helpful guidance on, what types of data are most relevant for assessing different types of risk. And it really hammers home the importance of data quality, making sure that the information you're using is accurate and up to date.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to build your entire risk assessment on shaky foundation.
Exactly. And once you've got that solid data foundation, then the real fun begins.
Great.
API 580, it walks you through the process of analyzing all this information to identify those potential damage mechanisms, estimate the POF and the COF, and calculate the overall risk for each piece of equipment.
And this is where the expertise and judgment really come into play, right? It's not just about plugging numbers into a formula.
Absolutely. Interpreting the data and translating it into actionable insights. That's really key. API 580, it actually outlines different approaches to risk analysis, ranging from qualitative methods that rely heavily on expert judgment to more quantitative methods that involve, complex models and calculations.
So you can tailor your approach based on the complexity of the system, I guess, and the level of detail that you need.
Precisely. And remember, API 580, it really encourages this team approach to this whole process, bringing together engineers, inspectors, financial analysts, and other experts to make sure you're considering all the angles.
It's fascinating to see how all these different pieces fit together. So you've done your risk analysis, you've pinpointed the areas of highest risk. What happens next? What do you do with all that information?
Well, now comes the really crucial part. Developing your risk management plan. This is where you decide what concrete actions you're going to take to actually mitigate those risks that you've identified.
So it's not just about identifying problems. It's about formulating solutions, moving from assessment to action.
You got it. And API 580, it emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
Right.
The best approach is going to vary depending on the specific equipment, the nature of the risk, and a whole host of other factors.
So you might recommend different strategies for different situations, like a customized approach to risk mitigation.
Absolutely. For some equipment, more frequent inspections might be the answer. For others, it might involve, upgrading materials, modifying operating procedures, adding safety systems, or even, replacing the equipment altogether.
So it sounds like you have a whole arsenal of tools at your disposal.
That's right. The key is choosing the most effective and cost-efficient strategies for each scenario. And API 580, it even provides guidance on how to, factor in the cost of potential damage versus the cost of those different mitigation strategies. So it's helping you strike that balance between, safety and budget.
Wow. There's a lot to consider. It really underscores the importance of having a structured approach like RBI.
It does. And here's another key point that API 580 it really drives home. Risk management, it's not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. It's a dynamic system that requires, constant attention.
Right, that makes sense. Equipment deteriorates over time, operating conditions change, new information emerges. You can't just set it and forget it.
Exactly. That's why API 580 it emphasizes the importance of reassessment, regularly reviewing your RBI program, making adjustments as needed, and just making sure that it remains aligned with the evolving reality of the facility.
This is starting to sound like a full-time job. Who typically takes ownership of all this in a facility?
Well, API 580 it makes it very clear that RBI it's a collaborative effort.
Right.
It involves multiple stakeholders, but it does highlight the critical role of the inspector.
But we're not talking about your typical inspector, right?
Yeah.
Like the one who's just, going through a checklist and ticking boxes.
Right. This isn't just about ticking boxes. The inspector envisioned in API 580, it's someone with deep technical knowledge, analytical skills, and the authority to actually make decisions about risk mitigation.
Yeah.
They need to be able to interpret data, understand the nuances of the equipment and processes, and really advocate for the necessary actions.
That sounds like a pretty demanding role.
It is, and API 580 even recommends that inspectors receive, specialized training in RBI principles and practices,
Right.
to make sure they have the expertise needed to effectively execute those responsibilities.
So it's not just about years of experience. It's about having the right training and qualifications to really navigate the complexities of RBI.
Precisely. And API 580, it doesn't just focus on the technical aspects of RBI. It also emphasizes the importance of thorough documentation and record keeping.
Right. I can see how that's crucial. If a serious incident does occur, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've taken a systematic and responsible approach to risk management. Those records can be incredibly valuable.
Exactly. API 580 recommends documenting everything. Your initial goals, the data you collected, the assumptions during the risk analysis, the decisions about mitigation strategies, even the training and qualifications of your personnel.
Wow.
It's about creating a clear and auditable trail of your entire risk management process.
So it's not just about doing the work, it's about showing your work. Transparency and accountability are really key here.
That's right. And this documentation, it serves multiple purposes. It helps ensure consistency and accountability. It provides valuable insights for future reassessments. And it can even be used to, demonstrate compliance with regulations.
It's fascinating how all these different aspects of RBI, they work together to create this really comprehensive approach to safety and risk management.
It's a really well thought out framework, I think. It really covers all the bases, from the nitty-gritty technical details to the practical considerations of implementation.
But before we move on, I'm curious, what are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes that people make when they're trying to implement RBI? It seems like there's a lot of room for error if you're not careful.
That's a great question. And thankfully, API 580, it actually dedicates a whole section to addressing this very topic.
Hey, good. I'm all ears. Give me the insider tips on what to avoid.
Well, one of the biggest pitfalls is failing to clearly define your your goals right from the start.
Okay.
If you don't have a crystal clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve with your RBI program, it's really easy to get sidetracked or lose focus along the way.
Right. So it's kind of like setting off on a road trip with no destination in mind.
Exactly. Another common mistake is not involving all the necessary stakeholders. RBI, this is not just an engineering function. It requires input and buy-in from operations, maintenance, finance, safety, and environmental personnel, and really anyone who has a stake in the safe and efficient operation of the facility.
Yeah, it's a team sport, not a solo act.
Absolutely. And another pitfall is relying too heavily on, software or generic data without considering the unique circumstances of your facility. Every facility has its own, quirks and complexities. And you can't just, plug and play with a cookie cutter approach.
So you can't just outsource your judgment to a computer program. You need that human element, that understanding of the specific context.
That's crucial. API 580, it also cautions against over-relying on inspections as the sole means of risk mitigation. Inspections are important, but they're just one piece of the puzzle. Remember, RBI is about managing risk holistically, using all the tools in your toolbox.
Right. So it's not just about, inspecting more frequently. It's about using a multifaceted approach from tweaking operating procedures to upgrading materials to adding redundant safety systems. It's about attacking the problem from multiple angles.
Exactly. And finally, API 580, it warns against becoming complacent. Just because you have an RBI program in place doesn't mean you can, sit back and relax. Risk is a dynamic beast,
right,
and it requires, constant vigilance.
You need to continuously monitor, reassess, and adapt your approach as needed. It's about staying ahead of the curve, not just, reacting to problems after they arise.
That's right. It's about embracing that mindset of continuous improvement and acknowledging that the work of risk management is never truly finished.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into API 580 and the whole world of risk-based inspection.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure unpacking all this with you.
Absolutely. Now on to part 3 of this deep dive. But before we go, a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey. Remember, this is just a glimpse into the vast world of API 580.
Right.
We always encourage you to check out the document itself for the full picture. There's a wealth of knowledge waiting to be explored. All right, so we've covered a ton of ground already, but there's one area of API 580 that I'm particularly curious about, and that's this whole concept of integrity operating windows.
Okay, yeah. IOWs.
IOWs, yeah. What exactly are those, and why are they so important in the context of RBI?
So IOWs, they're all about defining the safe operating limits for your equipment. It's like having these guardrails, right?
Okay.
That keep your processes within a safe zone. Think of it this way. Every piece of equipment, it has certain parameters, right? Like temperature, pressure, flow rate, that need to stay within specific bounds to ensure that the equipment stays, in good shape.
Okay.
And to prevent damage.
So it's like having speed limits, but for your industrial processes.
Yeah,
right?
that's a great analogy.
You don't want to push things too far beyond what they're designed to handle.
Exactly. And API 580, it really stresses that operating outside those boundaries, even for short periods, can significantly increase the risk of failure. It's like, driving your car at 100 miles an hour. You might get away with it for a while, but eventually something's gonna give.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So how do you determine these IOWs? Is it just a matter of like picking some arbitrary numbers?
Yeah.
Or is there a more scientific approach?
Oh, it's definitely not about picking random numbers. API 580 it provides some pretty detailed guidance on how to determine these IOWs, and it's really based on a thorough understanding of the equipment, the materials it's made from, the process fluids it handles, and the potential consequences of exceeding those limits.
Okay.
You got to consider things like the design specifications, the operating history, and even the potential failure modes.
So it's a blend of engineering principles, data analysis, and just good old-fashioned risk assessment.
Exactly. And here's a really important point. API 580, it emphasizes that operating within those IOWs, it's not just a good practice, it's actually essential for the validity of your entire RBI assessment.
Okay, because if you're constantly operating outside those safe boundaries, then your risk calculations are going to be way off.
Right. It's like trying to predict the weather without taking into account the seasons.
Right.
Your predictions are going to be wildly inaccurate if you ignore those fundamental operating limits.
Okay, IOWs clearly crucial. But how do you actually make sure that operators stay within those boundaries? I mean, it's one thing to define those limits on paper, but it's another thing to actually enforce them in a real world setting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's where things like training, monitoring systems, and even automated safeguards. That's where all those things come into play. API 580, it recommends things like comprehensive operator training programs to make sure that everyone understands those limits, as well as process alarms and control systems that can alert operators or even automatically shut down equipment if it starts operating outside those safe zones.
So it's a multi-layered approach, a combination of human vigilance and technological safeguards all kind of working together to keep things running safely.
Exactly. And API 580, it also highlights the importance of documenting any deviations from those IOWs, even if they're unintentional or short-lived.
Okay.
Because these records, they provide valuable insights for future analysis, and they can help identify patterns or systemic issues that need to be addressed.
So it's like having a continuous feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
You're learning from those deviations and fine-tuning your RBI program to prevent them from happening again.
That's exactly the mindset that API 580 it encourages. This continuous improvement, proactive risk management, and a commitment to really refining your processes over time.
This whole discussion about IOWs, it really drives home the point that RBI, it's about much more than just inspections. It's about understanding the entire operating context.
Right.
Setting clear boundaries and implementing multiple layers of protection to really minimize risk.
Absolutely. And API 580, it goes even further. It outlines a whole range of other risk mitigation strategies that go beyond, just inspections. It's like a whole toolkit of options to help manage those risks effectively.
Tell me more about those tools. What are some of the other strategies that API 580 recommends?
Well, one really powerful strategy is just equipment replacement. Sometimes, no matter how diligently you inspect or how carefully you operate within those IRWs, certain pieces of equipment, they just reach a point where they're simply no longer reliable or safe to operate.
So it's like an old car.
Yeah.
Right. At some point, it's more cost effective to just get a new one than to keep pouring money into repairs.
Exactly. And API 580 it provides some guidance on how to make those tough decisions, taking into account factors like the age of the equipment, its repair history, the cost of replacement, and of course the potential consequences of a failure.
Right. So it's about weighing those risks and benefits, and sometimes a proactive replacement can save you a lot of headaches and potential disasters down the road.
That's right. And API 580 also it discusses a technique called fitness for service assessment. And this involves evaluating any flaws or damage that are found during inspections to determine whether the equipment is still safe to operate.
So it's like getting a second opinion from a specialist.
Yeah.
Confirming whether that crack or that corrosion is a minor issue or a major red flag.
Precisely. And these assessments, they often involve, sophisticated engineering calculations and analysis to determine things like the remaining strength of the equipment and the likelihood of those flaws, growing or leading to a failure.
It's remarkable how much science and engineering goes into keeping these facilities running safely. It's a testament to the ingenuity and dedication of the people who work in these industries.
It's truly impressive. And API 580 it even delves into more specialized risk mitigation strategies like process modifications to reduce the inherent hazards of certain chemicals.
Okay.
Upgrading materials to make the equipment more resistant to corrosion or fatigue, adding redundant safety systems to prevent, single points of failure, and even, modifying operating procedures to minimize the risk of human error.
So it's a truly holistic approach, looking at every facet of the operation to identify those potential risks, and then developing this multi-pronged strategy to mitigate those risks.
Exactly. And that brings us back to what I consider the most important message of API 580. It's not just about blindly following, rules or checking boxes. It's about fostering a culture of safety,
Right.
and continuous improvement.
It's about integrating risk management into the DNA of your organization, right?
Yeah.
Making it an integral part of how you do business, not just an afterthought.
Exactly. And API 580, it provides that comprehensive framework and a powerful set of tools to help you achieve that goal.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything in this epic deep dive into the world of API 580 and risk-based inspection.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating topic with you.
Absolutely, and a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey. If you're hungry for more knowledge, be sure to check out the API 580 document itself. It's packed with valuable insights and practical guidance that we couldn't possibly cover in a single episode.
Yeah, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts and questions, on our YouTube channel.
Right.
We always appreciate hearing from our listeners and engaging in those discussions. It's all part of that continuous learning process, right?
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.
iLearna. Learn today, lead tomorrow.